Tonight, Mountain States Legal Foundation is honored to present Tara Ross. Tara is one of the nation's leading experts on the Electoral College, which is why it's important and why we must keep it. Tara prefaces her book, Why We Need the Electoral College, with this remark. The older I get, the more I think that if it ain't broke, don't fix it is always the best approach to the Electoral College. Yet some aspects of the system sound odd to our democratic-minded society. But making the system more democratic to accommodate modern sensibilities is not the answer. We serve ourselves best if we educate voters about the reasons that our founders established checks and balances in our Constitution and in our presidential election system. The founders created checks and balances in 1787 to protect American liberty from the imperfections of human nature. Humans are still imperfect. Safeguards are still needed. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tara Ross.
I was wondering what section she was going to read. It's true. I've been writing about this subject for nearly 20 years, and my first book about the Electoral College, I did kind of propose some minor changes here or there. You know, maybe we could automate the electors or something along those lines. But now, talking to me here, I'm older than I look. Like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years. We really, what we need is education, and we need to understand it better. The system's not broken. It's fine just like it is. So thanks for coming, and I hope this is helpful. It's a presidential election year, and I hope we all leave here knowing a little bit more about the Electoral College, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. But, if I'm really unclear, just raise your hand. I'm good. So I'm just going to start off with this, because there's this perception that's out there that the Electoral College is for Republicans, right? It's a biased system. And you kind of understand if you look at some of the results that we've seen in, the people that have lost the popular vote while winning the Electoral College have all been Democrats. It's true. I list them right there for you: Grover Cleveland, Al Gore, and Hillary Clinton. There are two more that sometimes get mentioned. I will quibble about whether they were true examples of an Electoral College, winner losing the popular vote. But in 1824 and 1888, those also, 1876, those also were Democrats, just so you know, who did not benefit from the system that year. And in fact, Barack Obama, in the wake of Donald Trump's election, said there are some structures that sometimes are going to disadvantage Democrats. Is it true? Is the Electoral College biased? Is this an anti-democratic party institution? The answer, naturally, is no. It's a resounding no. And actually what you find, if you look at the history of states voting, is it actually goes back and forth. It swings from one extreme to another. And I've listed several examples here. In 1952, Eisenhower wins 18 states that have been voting Democratic since the 1920s. I mean, that's a big swing, and that's a lot of states. 1980s, we all remember this. Ronald Reagan was winning California and New York at the same time, and Texas. How could anybody ever compete with that, right? Well, Bill Clinton was like hold my beer, right? So Bill Clinton turns a whole mess of southern states blue for the first time in a long time. And of course, then by the time we get to the 2016 election, people are really very sure that nobody can win except for Hillary Clinton because of the massive advantage in the Electoral College for the Democratic Party. It's the Electoral College, the Washington Post declared in 2015. And then Donald Trump, of course, he proved that wrong by flipping a whole bunch of blue wall states that the Democratic Party was taking for granted. And the point of all these examples is just to show, look, this is actually a system that will just reward whoever is doing I thought I had a different slide there. It will reward whoever is doing the best job of coalition building in any particular given year. It is not pro-Republican. It is not pro-Democrat. It is a system that's American and that rewards the candidate that's doing the best job of that. Okay, so this is the outline for my speech. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk that much. I know I'm standing between you guys in like a blackjack table or something. So I am going to do a brief thing about the logistics just to make sure we're all on the same page about how the system works. I will spend most of my time on the constitutional history because I was told you guys would love that. And then I will highlight real quick the benefits of the system and proposals to eliminate in case anybody wants to know what to do. So starting with the Electoral College. So again, you guys probably know a lot of this, but I'll just make sure. The Electoral College occurs in two parts. The first part is the part that you're used to seeing. It's election day. It's when we all go to the polls and we cast our ballots. Now, we are actually, there is no national election on that day. There are 51 different processes. They're completely separate elections. Each state is and plus DC is holding its own election. I can count the number of states, so I always say that. I do know there's 50 states plus DC. Each one of these states purely democratic, okay? One person, one vote within each state, just like everybody says they want. States are conducting a statewide election for presidential electors. And this is an elected office, just like your governor or your attorney general in some states. And any statewide office you can think of, presidential electors are being elected. Now, most states do this winner take all. You cast one ballot, and it determines your whole slate of electors. I'm from Texas. We have 38 electors, so I cast one ballot for whichever slate of electors I want, and other Texans do the same thing. Now, something people don't always know, these are completely different slates, okay? There were literally 38 Republicans ready to serve Texas. There were 38 Democrats ready to serve Texas. There were 38 for the Libertarian and for the write-in candidates, and all of the other people who had earned a spot on the ballot had their own 38 people ready to support them. And this is just important. I can talk about it later if you want to, but some of you may know there's a Supreme Court case pending about whether electors have the right to be independent. Well, they do, but if you look at the way they're elected, most of the time, I should say, I think they do. Sorry, I should back up there. The Supreme Court's going to make its own decision. Like I said, we can go there later if you want to. But it's not really that big a worry because you're counting on Republicans to vote Republican and Democrats to vote Democrat and third-party candidates to vote for third-party candidate they like, which is why in 2000 and 2016, it was so hard to get anybody to flip. I mean, the Bush electors were getting death threats, some of them. Not a single one, not one flipped. There was one Gore that abstained to make a political point, and she's on record saying if her vote was going to give it to Gore, she wasn't choosing that moment to make a political statement. And that's how most faithless electors are. Anyway, so like I said, we've got an election, and the goal is to identify which electors are going to go on to phase 2. Phase 2 didn't ever used to be in the news, and it has been lately. And of course, phase 2 is in December, about a month after we cast our ballots. And the 538 electors that were selected on Election Day, they go cast ballots in the second phase of the election. It takes 270 electors to win. And if no one gets this, well, guess what? There's another phase you could go to if you really had to. We have not used it that often in our history, but there is a contingent election process in the House of Representatives. In this election, each state has one vote. The House elects the president. The Senate elects the vice president. One vote, I said one vote per state delegation. 26 states needed to win. In 1801, it took 36 ballots. That's a crazy story, because Aaron Burr, of course, being Aaron Burr, couldn't let it go. So, I'll sidetrack for just 1 second to say Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied by accident because of the way the system was then. And Aaron Burr was supposed to be the vice presidential candidate, and Thomas Jefferson was the president. Everybody knew that, everybody. But technically it was a tie because they both got the same number of electors. And so, of course, Aaron Burr thought maybe he could be president. That didn't work out for him. All right. So I told you guys I'm going to try to do a little bit deeper dive than I normally do on the history. So talking about the Constitutional Convention and why did we get this process, the one that just took me 5 minutes to explain, instead of just a straight up and down national vote. How did that happen? Well, one thing to know is that our Constitutional Convention was a unique moment in time. We will probably never, ever see anything like that again. But there were delegates that were representing every single state except Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was still scared that they would get trampled, and they did not believe that what was going to come out would be good for them. And so they didn't go. These were students of history. They had served in the colonial legislatures at that point. Many were lawyers. They were well-read in the work of these philosophers. At one point, James Madison wrote Thomas Jefferson, who was overseas in France serving as an ambassador, and he asked for books. And Jefferson sent him books. They read so much more than probably most modern-day Americans can understand. They didn't have political parties. So there was no Republican Party bias or Federalist Party bias for you history buffs. There was no Whig Party. There was no Democratic Party. There was a bias in favor of their states, large versus small. So let me emphasize large versus small, not slave versus not slave, whatever you might hear. When you watch how the states lined up at the convention, the bias was some large states were comfortable with some things, and some small states were afraid of other things, which is why Rhode Island did not show up. Thomas Jefferson read the list of names the people that had been selected, and he wrote, "It's an assembly of demigods." He was really impressed. It was a really remarkable assembly. Another misperception that is out there, you've heard it as many times as I have. Oh, the founders, they were just elitists. They didn't trust the people. They thought that they should take all power out of the hands of the people because they didn't trust them. They just wanted to rule themselves or something. It's not true. It's just not true. The reality is, like I said, they were well-read. They knew their history way better than most of us do. They could cite to you what was going on in the Greek, this Greek republic or that Roman one. They knew all of this stuff. If you read the Federalist Papers and go down that list, they're discussing the ins and outs of all of these countries that came before them. And they knew the mistakes that had been made, or at least the dynamics they wanted to avoid. And they worked really hard at it. And they also had their own experiences. They had just fought a war for self-governance. Right? They weren't elitists who didn't believe in self-governance. They were the opposite. They laid their lives on the line for this concept of we want to be in charge of ourselves and govern ourselves. But they knew something we've forgotten. And they knew that if they had been given a seat at the table at Parliament, they would have been outvoted time and time again by the majority of citizens at home in England. It went to battered that they got to vote in Parliament. And they remembered that. We forget. I included this last bullet point because there is a line in a book by Carol Birkin, and I love it. And she says, they were sitting there. And it's like at the end of the summer. They've been talking back and forth. At the end of the summer of 1787, and they sat there, and they discussed how to put checks and balances on themselves. They knew they were the most likely men. They were all men. They were the most likely men to be senator. They knew one of them was going to be president, George Washington. They sat there and discussed how to put checks and balances on themselves because they didn't trust themselves either. They knew that power corrupts. They didn't trust anybody. They didn't trust elected officials. They didn't trust the people. They didn't trust the state. They didn't trust the federal government. They didn't trust the judiciary. They didn't trust the legislature. They didn't trust the president. They didn't trust themselves. They knew everybody can be corrupted. Power corrupts. And so the point of our government is to protect against human imperfection. And I think if modern Americans could understand that one point about the founders, it would really, really change a lot. Okay, so I just thought I'd throw some quotes out at y'all about democracy. So you guys have heard the founders did not say this. None of them said it. But in modern times, we say something like, pure democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? The sheep doesn't care that it got to vote. It's still on the dinner plate. It doesn't care. So the founders understood, and that's why they said these things that they said. The evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy. Edmund Randolph in Virginia. Provide a cure for the evils under which the country labored, that in tracing these evils to their origin, every man had found it in the turbulence and follies of democracy. Gouverneur Morris, I understand there's a debate about how to pronounce his name, but I think it's Gouverneur Morris. Apparently, Abigail Adams was very, very phonetic, and so when she spelled his name, that's kind of how it came out. So otherwise, we don't know. Every man of observation had seen in the Democratic branches of the state legislatures precipitation in Congress changeableness, in every department excesses against personal liberty, private property, and personal safety because of democracy. So here's some other founders on democracy. John Adams. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. Never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. Benjamin Rush is one of the greatest of evils of democracy. John Witherspoon, of course, signed the Declaration of Independence. Pure democracy cannot subsist long nor be carried into the Department of State. It is very subject to caprice and the madness of popular rage. And Fisher Ames, of course, called it a volcano. There's another quote I was thinking of on the way here, which I would have put in if I thought of it earlier. But there's another founder who said something to the effect of, he would never, ever trust the first instinct of the people, but he would always trust the reasoned, like the second thought of the people, kind of the rational, but never the first instinct, because the first instinct is too subject to this kind of stuff that goes on. Now, so this is a dilemma, right? They said they don't like democracy. They don't trust it. It's a volcano. It's evil. It's a whole mess of stuff. But they believe in self-governance. The genius of the people must be consulted. The government cannot subsist long without the confidence of the people. And of course, the popular election of one branch of the national legislature is essential to every plan of free government. They believed in the concept of self-governance. Like I said, they just fought a whole war over this. They laid their lives on the line. Some of them lost brothers, fathers, even daughters and mothers because of the war for self-governance. So what do? How do you reconcile these two ideas? And then you've got more conflicts going on. You've got small states and large states at each other's heads all the time. In the context of the presidential election, here's some quotes. Roger Sherman: "The people will generally vote for some man in their own state, and the largest state will have the best chance for the appointment." Charles Pinckney: "The most populous states, by combining in favor of the same individual, will be able to carry their points." But I really like Gunning Bedford the best. This is like my favorite quote because it's italicized in the notes or it's underlined or something because it comes out this way always. "I do not trust you," but he throws gentleman in there. Like he's in the middle of this. He's got to be polite. "I do not trust you. If you possess the power, the abuse of it could not be checked. And what then would prevent you from exercising it to our destruction?" Oh, I love that. Of all the quotes, it's the only one I ever remember, and could just say off the top of my head. The rest of them I have to go look it up. But I love that because it shows how much fear was in the room, especially in the parts of the small states. Like I said, Rhode Island wouldn't even send anybody because they were so fearful. The small states were sure they would be trampled. Remember in the Articles of Confederation, they had a one state, one vote representation, and now here they are in a convention in which large states are advocating for one person, one vote. And it was a big, big problem. And then, so here's another conflict that comes up during the Constitutional Convention. And when it came to the topic of presidential selection, now I should say they discussed all sorts of crazy ideas. There was, maybe we'll have 3 executives, maybe we'll let the governors vote, they had a whole mess of ideas. But the 2 things that ended up on the table most often that were kind of the 2 main ideas were a direct vote, just like you hear people advocate for now, and legislative selection. Congress picks the president. That would be fun. Can you imagine what that would look like? CNN and Fox News, and yeah, that'd be great. But that's what they were discussing, and the main problem that came up with legislative selection. So, the direct vote problem, of course, there's the just downfalls of democracy, and then you get to the legislative selection, you're talking about, well, what about separation of powers? And they would discuss, should the president be can we re-elect him? Can he have more than one term? And how does that all work out? And what are we going to do? And it was just, they couldn't agree. That's the long and short of it. James Madison expresses this principle of separation of powers. The appointment of the executive should either be drawn from some source or held by some tenure that will give him a free agency with regard to the legislature. And nobody knew what to do. Luther Martin, this is another great quote, actually. "We were on the verge of dissolution, scarce held together by the strength of a hair. as you know, the Great Compromise solved this problem for the legislature. They finally figured out we'll have one body, the Senate, that is one state, one vote, and we'll have one body that is one person, one vote. So it's a compromise, and it reflects both principles. And the Electoral College ultimately reflects these principles. I'm going to divert to this real quick before I tell you how they actually figured out the Electoral College. Is it about slavery? No. It's definitely not. It is very, I don't know, it's all the subject, it's what everybody wants to talk about now, that they claim it was just a relic of slavery, we should ditch it, and all of this stuff. Now, what I will say is, if they can tar the Electoral College with this black mark of slavery and say, look, no, it's evil, it's, we don't, then of course you're going to get rid of the Electoral College, because it just seems like a remnant of something that we all reject, that we all disagree with, that we all wish had not happened. But it has nothing to do with slavery, not even a little bit. Now, the two things that happened that people hang their hat on and say, well, this is why. One is the Three-Fifths Compromise, which of course really had to do with representation for Congress. But when they moved on to the Electoral College, they decided you'd have the same number of electors as you have congressmen plus senators. And so it gets roped in. But that really had to do with the representation in Congress and how to count people for purposes of House representation only. Now, the South wanted to count everybody. Everybody. And the North said, no, if you want to count your slaves, we're going to count our horses and stuff. And so who really benefited more is the question. And what it ends up being, if you read what happened at the convention and the compromise that was made, it really came down to, okay, fine, we're going to reduce your representation a little bit, and in return you pay less taxes. And that's how it worked out. So both the North and the South benefited from that compromise, and that's what it was. So it's inaccurate to say that one side was evil or benefiting more or what have you. It was a compromise. An ugly one that we all wish we could kind of take back, but that's what it was. The other thing that happened that people like to hang their hat on in this regard is this quote that I've given you from James Madison, and it sounds terrible. It sounds terrible enough that I'm not going to read it out loud because, we don't use some of those words anymore. But he said that, and so people say, well, and then shortly after that, he mentioned the use of electors. And so people say, well, this is why. The Electoral College is about slavery, and James Madison did it. Well, no. Again, if you go read the whole thing in context, what you see is James Madison was actually talking about separation of powers. They were talking about, should the president be reelected or reelectable if he's selected by the legislature? And this was an off-the-cuff remark that he made that was not the main topic that day. And not only that, he was not the first person to discuss electors. In fact, the first people to discuss electors that day were people who had worked against slavery during their lifetime. So again, when you read these discussions, if you don't just take a quote out of context, but if you actually look at it and read the discussions, what you see is there is a divide between small and large states, not between slave and not slave. And the compromises that came about were because they were trying to solve this problem. How do you have a country, a big diverse country, they thought, of 13 states. We now have a 50. How do you take such a big, diverse country with states, sovereign states of differing size, and how do you make sure that there is fair governance for all? And small states and large states felt differently about that, and those were the compromises that came out was because of that issue. All right. So I said I was going to tell you how the Electoral College came to be, but nobody could do that. It was behind closed doors, and so we can tell you that it happened behind closed doors, and that there was one report of it. John Dickinson, he wrote down, many years later, he said, this is what happened. We all sat down, and after some conference, James Madison, he did spell Madison that way, took a pen and paper and sketched out a mode for electing the president agreeable to the present provision. And that is what we know about how the Electoral College came to be in that committee that was drafting things for the whole convention. When they brought it to the convention was shocked. What just happened here? And somebody asked for an explanation. And really, what you end up finding is that most of them thought it was kind of a good idea. They thought it solved this problem of corruption because the electors would be scattered across the country. They wouldn't be all gathered in one place like a Congress would be. They had thought if there was legislative selection, Congress would be all in one place in Washington, D.C., or, well, the capital they would eventually select, which we now know is Washington, D.C., and it would be too easy to corrupt them because they would all be in one place, as opposed to electors who are scattered across the country, and even if you manage to corrupt one or two, it's really hard to get the whole lot of them, probably harder to get rid of to control the election outcome. And the other discussion that was a focus during that time was the contingent election procedure. At the time, they switched it from, it was in the Senate, oh gosh, I'm going to say it backwards. It was in the Senate, and they wanted to switch it to the House. And the discussion was, well, the Senate can impeach him. Is this really, they were talking about separation of powers again. And then they also got into a discussion about, well, if you switch it to the House, then they felt like they were going to be the small states would be at a disadvantage. And so that was what they were talking about. It was all of the old same stuff about population versus state and about separation of powers. And so they ended up switching it from the Senate to the House, and they ended up changing the provision so that the House would vote by state delegations, as I said. So that would help to ease the concern about large states having too much power. So some of you, before we came to dinner, were telling me, we don't have a democracy. Here it is. No, we have a republic. And you guys know that quote. Benjamin Franklin came out of the Constitutional Convention, and a matron asked him, well, doctor, what do we have? And he said, we have a republic if you can keep it. Our Constitution solves this difficult problem. How do you balance self-governance with the dangers of democracy? How do you make all of these things work together so that you can be self-governing even as you protect yourself from the tyranny of the mob? And our Constitution solves it by blending the best aspects of democracy, republicanism, and federalism. Federalism, of course, is state-by-state action. We take the best principles of each of these different kinds of governments, and we put them all together in one document. And the Electoral College is just a reflection of these compromises that were made throughout the Constitution. Like I said, you have the same number of electors as you have congressmen. So large states have more electoral votes, but small states still have a guarantee of a certain amount of representation. They get a little leg up, okay? But the small states still cannot outvote the big states. 11 of the biggest states can outvote everybody else. And it takes, oh gosh, math on the fly is terrible. 40-something, 40 of, is that right? It's really late in Dallas, Texas right now, I'm letting you know. So I'm doing pretty well here. I would be like wrapping up and going to bed. It takes 40 states, 40, is 40 right? Anyway, it would take 40 states to get that done if you were the small states. They cannot outvote the big states. That's the way it is. James Madison, in fact, thought that the Electoral College was a compromise between the larger and smaller states, giving to the latter the advantage in selecting a president from the candidates in consideration of the advantage possessed by the former in selecting the candidates from the people. And that's because they thought it would end up in the House contingent election most of the time. And so they felt like it was a balance there. That turned out to not be, but that's what they thought at the time. Okay, I'm going to run through this real quick because I think Q&A is really fun, and maybe you guys have questions. But the benefits of the Electoral College, this is great, Tara, but we've moved on. We've got political parties now. We've got things that the founders didn't anticipate. Does the Electoral College still serve us? And the answer is yes. Resoundingly, yes. It serves the principles that the founders intended to serve. It still ensures that a huge, diverse nation like our own, that the president has to pay attention to all of us, or at least to a really broad cross-section of us. He or she cannot focus too much on one type of individual or one type of region or subculture in this country. You just simply cannot get to 270 if you try to do that. Now, sometimes you hear people say, we should have democracy. Like the system we have right now is not democracy. That's not true. Like I said, the very first phase of the election is purely democratic. The question is actually, do you want democracy standing by itself because you just have a national one person, one vote election? Or do you want democracy in combination with federalism? Do we want democracy at the state level, and then we combine that with the state-by-state election in December, the Electoral College vote? And I would argue that if you have democracy plus federalism, instead of just democracy standing by itself, you're better protected. If you just look at the kinds of campaigns that would be run with or without the Electoral College, you can see how easily this could fall apart. Obviously, with the Electoral College, it's unproductive to focus too much on one kind of voter. You have to have coalition building and cross-regional appeal if you're going to get anything done. It does, if you get 51% of California voters or 100% of California voters, you get the same thing from California. You're tapped out at 55. Same thing's true with any state. At some point, you've got to move on to the next state and try to get more votes. Otherwise, you cannot get to 270. Without the Electoral College, of course, this wouldn't be true at all. If you got 100% of California voters, you would far prefer 100% of California voters than 51%. And in fact, it would be much easier just to go someplace where people already like you. If you're a Republican, maybe you go to Houston and you say, oh, you oil guys, let me tell you what I got for you. We're going to work this out. And you give them anything they want. If you're a Democrat, maybe you go to San Francisco. Let me tell you how I'm going to help the environment. And you give it's just so easy. And it's not even malevolent or mean, it's efficient. This is such a huge country. You have limited time, you have limited resources. You simply cannot do everything for everybody, so you're going to be as efficient as you possibly can. And so you need a presidential election structure that will encourage the opposite if you want to avoid that kind of over-focus on one kind of voter. Now, Hillary Clinton, of course, showed us that that's exactly what you need to not do, right? She got 20% of her vote from New York and California. She was not rewarded for that. But if she had been, can you imagine what would happen the next election? They would double down on the strategy. Now, I'm going to throw one thing real quick here. You guys may or may not know. Hillary Clinton actually thought that she was going to win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote in the weeks leading up to the election. So she actually did this to herself on purpose, okay? She didn't mean to lose the Electoral College, but she meant to rack up the popular vote. She, through time, money, resources, busing people in, whatever they were doing in Chicago or friendly parts of the country, she didn't want to explain an Electoral College victory and a popular vote loss. She just didn't want to do it. She didn't like the Electoral College. So she did this to herself. If she had, the election was winnable. It was within her reach. All she had to do was do what the Electoral College encourages, which is to reach out to voters who aren't exactly like you. And if she had spent more time in blue wall states, if she had taken those resources away from the friendly areas and actually just used them, she probably would have won. It was that close, but her strategy was just exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to be. So fortunately, and I say this as a structural statement, not pro or against any candidate, but fortunately, this kind of behavior is not rewarded, because if it was, we would see it over and over and over again. The same thing happened in 1888 with Grover Cleveland. He won massive landslides in 6 southern states. He was getting up to 72% of the vote in some of those states. It was crazy. So he won the popular vote, but he lost the Electoral College vote. Now, I would argue that was the right result. We don't want a candidate to go to, I'm from the South, so we don't need people, even though I love Texas, we don't need people going to the South and racking up as many votes as they can in a few states and ignoring everybody else. This country is big, huge, diverse. We need something better than that. So sometimes people look at this and they say, yeah, that sounded really pretty, Tara. But we all know it's really about the swing states. No, it's actually not, even though you hear that all the time. And really, all you have to do is look at the history of states voting to see how not true that is. Okay, states change all the time. Earlier, I was talking about Ronald Reagan and how he was winning California, New York, and Texas all at the same time. Okay, it wasn't that long ago that was happening. You can look at, there's a bunch of southern states that have changed their allegiances multiple times. They voted for Bill Clinton, would not vote for Barack Obama. or Hillary Clinton. There's no way they would do that. And there's so many examples like that. West Virginia, 2000, was a safe blue state when that election started. George W. Bush flipped that state, okay? Nobody ever talks about this. Everybody's so focused on Florida. But if he had not flipped West Virginia, he would have lost the election. But he saw an opening. He saw West Virginia was getting really unhappy with the environmental policies of the Democratic Party. And so he went for it. And he got West Virginia. States change all the time. So what I say is safe states are not unimportant. They've just made up their minds earlier in the process, and they probably did it based on the governance that preceded the election. And when they start to become unhappy, they'll let you know really fast. And, by the way, political parties will care. So I will give you an example of that. In 2016, Utah was pretty upset. They didn't really like either one of the candidates, and they were threatening to vote third party. Well, Mike Pence was dispatched quickly to a small, red, safe state in the days before the election. Who's saying a small, red, safe state doesn't matter? It's just not true. The Republican Party was terrified of losing Utah. Today, sometimes I'm in debates talking whatever about the Electoral College, and we're going back and forth. And one time I was sitting there, this was like 5 or 6 months ago, and it was actually a Republican that I was debating, but he was a national popular vote lobbyist, and he said, "Oh, God, help us if Texas goes purple." And so I looked at him, and I was like, well, so which is it? Texas is safe, red, unimportant, or Texas is really important and don't let it go purple? And of course, the answer is every state matters all the time. Every state matters. You cannot get to 270 if you have only swing states on board. That math, I'm not good at math, but that math does not work. Okay, so moderation and compromise. This is another benefit of the Electoral College that sometimes people have more trouble with because it does support the two-party system, and sometimes, you want to vote for somebody that's not in one of the two major parties, and I get that. However, it's not enough to be discontent with where you are. You got to look and see where you would go. And where we would go without the Electoral College is to a multi-party system like France. And they literally have runoffs where somebody got in the runoff with less than 20% of the vote. Two candidates, less than 20% of the vote, because the vote was so fractured. And I mentioned the 2016 GOP primaries here. Again, I'm not bashing any particular candidate. But if you look at the dynamics of what was happening in that 17-person race, what was happening is nobody cared to compromise with anybody at all. I mean, the attitude was, yeah, my 18% beats your 17%. Don't care. Just don't care. And that dynamic was rewarded in the primaries. So, I mean, whoever came out of those primaries was going to have trouble because of the fractured nature of the primaries. And, look, that's just the primaries right now. But if we were to change to a national popular vote, you can expect that dynamic to move to Election Day. And that would be really bad for our country. Another little-known benefit is that the Electoral College helps to control fraud and error. Okay, so this is for a few different reasons. One is that nothing works out. You can't steal the votes unless several things come together for you all at once. One is the national total has to be close enough that flipping one or two states will actually make a difference. Despite recent elections, that's actually historically doesn't happen that often. And you have to also be able to steal votes in the particular state where it would matter. Okay, so you got to predict before 2000 that Florida, if you steal 500-something votes there, it's going to make a difference. Nobody knew that. Nobody knew that. Now, people thought maybe in 2004 that stealing Ohio would matter. Well, what happened there? What happened is everybody went to Ohio. I had friends, y'all probably had friends, that went to Ohio to watch the polls and to make sure that nothing bad was happening in Ohio. Now, I'm not going to pretend that you can stop everything from happening because, again, we're living in an imperfect world with imperfect human beings. You can't stop everything, but you can make it as hard as humanly possible. And if you have the Electoral College, you shrink down the number of places that need to be watched. And if you have no Electoral College, any vote stolen anywhere matters. It affects the national outcome. You can steal votes in the bluest blue California precinct or the reddest red Texas one, and you could affect the entire national tally, okay? So again, I mean, look, nobody can play defense in every single precinct in this country. We just can't get it done. The Electoral College provides us protection by shrinking down the number of areas we have to watch and just making it overall harder. Okay, so anti-electoral college efforts that are out there, so that you guys know. Some of you may know about the National Popular Vote effort, and they had a really creative idea, and the creative idea was, we don't need a constitutional amendment. That's too hard. It would take 38 states. No, we can't get that. Let's sign a contract. And so they have asked states to sign an interstate compact. And by the terms of the compact, participating states would give their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. So far, 15 states plus DC have signed this contract. So they have 196 electors committed to this scheme. They, and I've listed them for you there. It's going to be challenged. We'll see what happens, but I think it would be much, much easier to stop it before it ever happened, because while we would love the courts to always do the right thing, sometimes they don't. So near misses that you guys know, they were working on it in Virginia. I understand it's dead in the Virginia Senate, should be dead in the Virginia House, but I'm going to put a little question mark by that. They've been working on Florida, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada. Nevada, the governor actually vetoed it last year. It went all the way through the legislature. National Popular Vote is a very well-funded effort, and they have lobbyists in all of these states, and it's, it just makes it a hard effort to fight. And they have hired lobbyists on both sides of the political aisle to make it look as bipartisan as they can. However, if you look at who's actually supporting it, only blue states have supported it so far. So again, I'm not trying to make the Electoral College partisan, because I do not think it is, but in this effort, it has become a little bit partisan. And like I said, there's a misperception that the Electoral College does not serve Democrats. I think it's wrong, but there's a perception out there, and so that's what's happening. So how can you defeat National Popular Vote? Well, some of you, Colorado, I don't know how many of you in here are from Colorado. It did pass the Colorado legislature, and now there is an initiative on the ballot later this year. And so that's something to work towards and to help. We'll see how that goes. I hope it goes well. They apparently got a whole bunch of signatures for that petition. I think it was more than anybody had achieved in a really, really long time for something like that. So they, if you live in Colorado, go help that. So this is kind of my idea, or I like this idea, I should say. And I love coming up with ideas to complicate things for them. So like I said, this is a state-driven process, and every state is in charge of itself. So if you think a state like Texas or any other state that doesn't want to sign this compact has to go along, you've got another thing coming. No, they do not have to. There are so many ways you can complicate things for NPV, and I encourage you to help your state legislators to think about that. For instance, you could say, we're no longer going to cast one ballot for the whole slate of electors. In Texas, we're giving you 38 votes. Have fun. Go vote for each of the individual electors. And that is really, really hard to tally later when you're trying to decide who won. In 1960 in Alabama, that actually did happen. And confused. You will hear people to this day that say JFK lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College, and it's about Alabama and how you tally that. And political scientists disagree on how to do it, because when you separate, it's just hard. It's hard to do it. Another idea, you could say, we're going to release our winning vote totals, but not the losing vote totals. We'll do it after the meetings of the elector. You don't have to. Somebody got on my Facebook page and said, what if you just gave what if you said, okay, you're still going to cast a winner-take-all ballot, because we're used to thinking that way and it's just easier, but maybe in Texas you get 3 votes. So or in any other state. I use Texas all the time because I'm from Texas. But that would be really, really difficult, if Texas gave everybody 3 votes, because some people would go cast 3 ballots for the same candidate. Some people might say, well, I'm going to go cast 2 for this, but kind of like the Libertarians, so maybe I'll throw them a bone. You don't know what people are going to do, and there's no way to tally that. But even if you do take the winning totals, well, it's a really inflated total. And look, the whole thing would be really ugly, but it shows how bad NPV would be for this country. It would be a race to the bottom as states try to get their votes inflated in the national total if we are going to get rid of the Electoral College, which obviously I don't think we should do. A constitutional amendment is the sane way to do it, because then you can make non-participating states comply with a uniform standard. The way they're doing it, they can't make non-participating states do anything at all. And it could be great fun to disrupt them. Yeah, that's the Texan in me coming out. I can't help myself. I really can't. So, I was telling somebody here, so technically I was born in Rhode Island. It was the first sacrifice I made for my country because my dad was in the Navy, and we lived in Texas before and after, but my mom likes to laugh at me because some of you history buffs might know that Rhode Island used to be called Rogues Island because of their attitude. So my mom's like, oh man, Rhode Island and Texas all in one person. Jeez. Obviously, we could challenge the constitutionality of the National Popular Vote scheme. They base their whole scheme on the idea that states can give their electors or allocate their electors in any way they want, which is true, but you cannot allocate your electors in any way that violates some other portion of the Constitution. For instance, Texas couldn't say, we're going to only let white males vote while we decide how to allocate our electors. That violates a whole mess of provisions, especially in the amendments. So in the same way, Texas cannot, or any NPV state cannot allocate its electors in violation of Article 5. That is the article that stipulates it takes a supermajority to change the presidential election process. Other challenges that could come up to national popular vote, and that will come up, equal protection, because you have 50 states plus D.C., 51 different sets of rules governing elections. These are different laws about whether felons can vote. These are different early voting requirements. These are different ways to get an absentee ballot, whatever. There's how to count hanging chads, what triggers a recount. Again, none of this matters that these are different when you guys are in your election in Colorado or Wyoming or Montana, and I'm in my own election in Texas. A vote cast in your state cannot change an elector in mine. But if you say, yeah, you know what, a vote cast in Texas can change the identity of a California elector, then suddenly it does matter if I get more time to early vote, and somebody will sue. The guarantee clause might be a little bit of a stretch, but somebody's going to claim it. And congressional approval for the Interstate Compact under Article 1, Section 10 is another way to challenge this as well. Other anti-electoral college efforts, constitutional amendment obviously is proposed over and over again. It's a huge hurdle, and it seems unlikely, but I mention it because the national popular vote people are on record a long time ago, but they cleaned up their language since then, but they're on record a long time ago saying that a constitutional amendment is their end game. They know that national popular vote is going to create havoc, and they hope the havoc will help them to achieve the constitutional amendment that they have long wanted. Misinformation about the pending Supreme Court case, I put that because my understanding is that there are national popular vote people who are actually hoping that the Supreme Court says electors can be independent because they want people to be scared, and they want people to get rid of the Electoral College when they're so scared. So I've told you why this elector independence is not something to be afraid of. It's not, and it does not undermine the Electoral College, but you can expect to hear it. Misinformation about the founders and slavery, of course, because if you can demonize the Electoral College as a relic of slavery, it's so much easier to get rid of it. So I'm going to leave you with this quote, but then I would love to answer questions because they're more fun. John F. Kennedy was a huge supporter of the Electoral College, which people don't always know, but I love this analogy that he said. He said, okay, so it's not only the unit vote for the presidency, but a whole solar system of governmental power. If it is proposed to change the balance of power of one of the elements of the solar system, it is necessary to consider the others. Okay, so my example. If you change the gravitational pull of the sun, you throw the orbits of all the planets out of whack. You probably make Earth uninhabitable. Okay, you can't change one little thing and not expect a domino effect, because the domino effect will happen. So if you get rid of the Electoral College, nobody really knows just how extensive the damage would be, but I guarantee you that a lot of things would happen that nobody really anticipates. So I guess I'll go back to how you started. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So.